Next, we move on to Professor Mats Fischer-Moller, who was recently appointed as Professor of Food Policy at Scotland's Rural College, as well as leader of SRUC's upcoming Future Food Systems Challenge Centre, focusing on researching pathways to food system transformation. Before working in academia, he had a career as civil servant in the Danish Ministry of Food and Agriculture from 2009 until 2015, and as a senior food policy advisor for the Nordic Intergovernmental Collaboration from 2015 until 2020. He established the Nordic Food Policy Lab, aimed at helping governments around the world to navigate the increasing demands on making our food systems more sustainable. We look forward to hearing his insights.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the great overview, Tim, about like the state of the world. What are the problems we're facing, and hopefully I can offer a bit more of a practical view when faced with these huge system challenges. What are the options that we have as civil servants or as policy advisors in one way or another to start addressing those issues and create momentum for the kind of transformation that we want to see happen? I'm coming from a political science background, so I'll talk from a different angle than Tim. But I've been working for 5 years as a policy advisor on nutrition. So this area about human health and nutrition and food is very near and dear to my heart. And I know also how hard it is to grapple with these issues about sustainable diets, because we are asked by ministers or the press or whoever, okay, how do we then start these kind of transformations? And how can we start transformation towards more sustainable diets? And what I've seen in the Nordics and what I would like to share today is that with the right kind of analysis and with a bit of creativity, we can start like building alliances, using the political leverage to actually accelerate the appetite for change in the food system, also among the big food system players who we need to bring along in order to reach for actual systems transformation and not just tinkering around the edges of the food system. There we go. These are a different depiction of planetary boundaries, but we heard very clearly from Tim that we are on the wrong track. We know that parts of the world is significantly overshooting on our biospheric parameters, consuming way too many resources, and not leaving, which won't leave a great future for future generations. And we see that other parts of the world are under-delivering on human development. And when it comes to food, we see that many places we have both. We are both missing good nutrition and diet for our consumers, and we are overshooting our planetary boundaries. So no one has solved this, not in the wider economy and definitely not in food. So I'm not here to say that, well, the Nordics have all the answers. The good thing we heard from Tim is that there is no one simple solution, but we know that dietary change is identified as a key component of any transition towards more sustainable food system. We simply need to change our diets. And it's, if not new, then the awareness of this being a key component is rather new. So the good news is we know the direction of travel. We can disagree in the margins. Is the Eat Lancet diet the right one? Is the UK Eat Well guide the right one? Is the Harvard diet that Tim presented the right one? Maybe they aren't exactly the right one, but they are pointing to a very, very clear direction of travel for the food system. more green proteins, more fruit and veg, change our cereal consumption, and in not least our part of the world, significantly reduce meat and dairy. So we know where we need to go. It's new having this conversation at all. When I was the food policy advisor in the Danish ministry and worked on nutrition and sustainability, I was oftentimes asked not to present these kind of findings to the minister, because my former line manager said, well, don't take this to the minister. It's too politically inconvenient and we don't really have any good options anyways. So why bother? So it's good that the discussion is here. It's good that we know the direction of travel. It's bad that we're not producing what we ought to eat at the moment. A map of Scotland to the right shows, well, we have not that much great agricultural area, but sufficient agricultural area to sustain our population and have good nutrition. But the bottom shows that we are spending 75% of that area to feed livestock, and then we're spending the yellow for, that is, drinks and industrial, mostly area used for whiskey, and only the tiny green slice of the chart is actually what constitutes 80%, 90% of the food, the greens, the vegetables, the cereals. We have a perverse way of allocating our current resources, and the resources does not at all line up with what we ought to eat. And the food system stakeholders are, of course, embedded in this system. They will argue for the preservation of status quo. Both policy, farming, academia, we tend to reproduce status quo. We tend to, as Tim put it, find arguments why exactly we should be the ones producing dairy for the rest of the world. I've been working in England and Northern Ireland, in Ireland, in Scotland, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland. All of these countries say, well, we should not be the ones reducing our production. We are doing a great job, and then let the rest of the world decrease. And that's just not tenable. We tend to have these isolated and self-reinforcing systems that tells us that we're doing just fine. So how do we reach from that and go towards the kind of really transformational thinking that we need? That's what I hope to show you here. And as many of you who are nutritionists will know, we have the additional, of course, challenge that the wrong things are easy to the tongue. It's easy for people to consume sugar, salt, fat. It's easy for people to consume a lot of red meat, giving a lot of umami. It is perhaps a bit harder to get people to learn a diet that is different from the one we have at the moment. So there are both like political structural reasons and human biological reasons for us to do all the wrong things. So you can say the deck is stacked against the right thing. So how do we reach for that? And the Nordics doesn't have all the answers. I'm here to talk about like Nordic examples, but just to be fair, it's not as though we've solved it at all. In general, the richer you are, the more heavy your consumption is weighing on the planet. And I was a chief advisor for the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we managed to not reach 9 out of our 10 goals on nutrition. The only goal we managed to reach was reducing inequality in food, and that was because the highest earners started to eat less healthy. So we are definitely not in a position where we can brag and say, well, this is just working. But hopefully we are in a position where we can say, well, some things are working, and we do have some models from other parts of the food that we can perhaps translate into change in these areas that we need to see significant change in a very short period of time if we are to stay within planetary boundaries. And policymakers in the Nordics, as well as everywhere else, they are in this tricky position about pressure from climate activists, youth demanding more, pressure from the status quo, and to be fair, also being informed over decades from academia and farmers' alliances about fed with arguments that reinforce the status quo. So this is the minister, the Danish Minister of Food and Agriculture in the middle, and he's of course frustrated. He is in this really hard pressure position where previously, if he just made sure that there was a sufficient stream of income coming from Danish farmers, the Danish farmers were kind of satisfied, then he wasn't pressured very heavily. Now there's a huge pressure for the ministers of food and agriculture to find ways to navigate this transformation. And we can also see a good example from the Nordics as well, as usually the Nordic diets change quite fast. Some of the diets in Europe, at least, that usually are front-runner diets for what we see elsewhere. And we can just see, for instance, now that recent survey data from Sweden shows that Swedes at the moment are more inclined to adopt a plant-based diet for the sake of the planet and planetary health than for the sake of their own health. So usually we would think about, okay, once you have your own health secured, then you would think about like your near environment. And then only once that is secured, you will start thinking about, okay, what's happening on a global level. But actually at the moment, the climate cause is so strong in some of these populations that people would rather change diets to save the planet than to save their own lives. So that's also important for us to know when we're doing, for instance, messaging in the public sphere, what actually makes people do these changes. So who will then start lead? There's a lot of pressure, to be fair, to say, okay, well, Greta Thunberg and her generation, they're the ones who are leading us. Thank you very much. But it's also, you can also see that it's of course wonderful that we have youth activists pushing, but it's not really enough. We are dealing with a collective action problem. So the policymakers should be the ones leading. But increasingly we can see that there is a people doesn't believe that the policymakers will be able to solve this problem. I've been attending the Eat Stockholm Food Forum, and they every year ask all the spectators. They're some of the most nerdy food system thinkers on the planet. But who will lead this transformation? And each year we see a lower trust in the policymakers leading. So we can't expect policy to lead, even though they ought to solve this collective problem action. They want to also be re-elected, etc. And that's, of course, can be challenging. We can't expect necessarily farmers to lead because that's a threat to their current livelihood. We can't necessarily expect the food businesses, the retailers to lead because they know that consumers want sugar, sweet, salt. So where do we find leadership in this? It's challenging. And it's not just, and it's challenging everywhere. But the good thing is that we can see that if not clear leadership, then at least we start going from a position where we had like policy uniformity, everyone was just reinforcing status quo, towards some kind of policy discrepancy. There are shifts, ruptures in the political agenda. EU agricultural policy, for instance, where we can see that on the one hand, we have the Green New Deal stating that food is part of the green future. And then we have a less than optimal CAP reform, but still it's new. And one of the positive things I would say is that food is no longer allowed to set its own rules. We are being pressured from outside. So we need to level the expectation. Well, there are higher expectations from what we should be able to deliver. So what I hope to show you here is a helpful theoretical framework for people who want to improve human health and save the planet. And what I'm oftentimes referring to and using in my work as a civil servant, and also as a professor in food policy, is a multi-level perspective here from Farm for the Future. We see the landscape, the overarching graph, the lines that tells us the discourse, the global trends, the paradigmatic view of thinking. For instance, it's completely normal to eat 200 grams of meat a day in Europe, or 150. The landscape. We see the regime, we see that the status quo, the dynamically stable, all the food systems actors who preserve, maintain, make sure that there is enough food on the table, learns from the past in order to navigate the future. And then we see the niche, all the alternatives, the solutions for the future, the pockets of hope that are fighting to be the solution for the future. And what I'll show you is how to navigate this and use this in order to accelerate transition towards more healthy and sustainable diets. What we see at the moment is a big rupture in the global discourse, a huge change where food is no longer allowed to set its own rules, where climate change is significantly changing how we are talking about food. Not to discard biodiversity that Tim also told us about, but climate change seems to be the driving force for many of the food system discussions at the moment. And that landscape could definitely just be a bounce, and then the regime would bounce against it and bounce back to status quo. But if we put in place and make sure to support so that there is a niche, a forest of ideas that can influence the mainstream, then once the landscape changes, these new ideas will come up and say, hey, we are here. And many of the regime stakeholders, the main street dairies, the main street slaughterhouses, will perhaps start to see, okay, there is maybe something in this niche phenomena that we can learn from, make money from, and they can then realign the regime in order to be more sustainable for the future. So what I'm arguing is that we are seeing at the moment a window of opportunity, and we need to take good care of that, and we need to use it for the sake of food systems transformation. An example of this, how to support the niche. Well, new Nordic food, in the Nordic countries, we had a very lousy food culture. When a minister wanted to invite someone to come and have dinner, an international delegation, you would opt for a French restaurant or Italian restaurant. There weren't any Danish restaurants that boasted of local creativity. And 10 chefs went together and said, well, this can't be right. We have really good raw materials. We need to rethink our horrible food culture. That was endorsed and supported by Nordic governments, not to say, well, everything here is horrible, but the chefs had a point, and we just endorsed them with a little bit of money, a little bit of political wind in the back. Go for it. You're a niche phenomena, but let's see where you can take it. The big food also started embracing this transition of discourse. They could see, well, they could perhaps make more money if they wanted to produce more things at home rather than just export everything bulk to, for instance, Italy, and then get it back as a ham. They could then see, okay, they started experimenting within the businesses. They started reassessing their business strategies once they saw that this new niche, embracing that niche, was actually good for the revenue. That allowed them to start experimenting with alternatives. So, for instance, the slaughterhouses did not only then focus on meat, but they also focused on other things. They rebranded themselves as a protein company. Similar with the dairy, they could see there is an alternative to status quo, and we've been able to nurture it within our business, and we've been able to learn from it. We dare to be more bold when it comes to transformation. So this kind of thinking, changing from the niche, what can the food culture be? What can the future business opportunities look like? Have then over 15, 20 years trickled down and been so mainstream now in the big food policy players in Scandinavia that, for instance, we see Arla Foods, the biggest dairy cooperative in the world, going out to say we want to be carbon neutral by 2050. Then followed all of the Danish food council, like the Farmers Union, etc., and say they want to be carbon neutral as well. So it's just as an example to support the niche. And back in 17 years ago, there was no guarantee that this would be where this initiative would end. And there's, of course, no clear causal link between 10 chefs saying that we need to change food culture and the fact that we now have more radical climate change plans from the businesses. But the fact that the businesses have been this have allowed the businesses to start reimagining themselves, repositioning themselves, rethinking themselves and their role in the regime, have allowed the businesses to change. And that have led to something that resembles systems change, even though we only supported like this small niche phenomena about reimagining food. That leads me back to kale. We've seen similarly, kale is healthy, sustainable, cheap, and resilient, but it would be a perfect element to our diets. It really meets all the buzzwords, but it has been in decline for 100 years until 10 years ago. And now we've seen a 900% increase in the sales. How comes that something that is so counterintuitive, people wanting to suddenly buy kale? How can we work with that, learn from that, and hopefully emphasize that and use it in a way to accelerate change? And what I'm also using here, this is from Bill Sharp, is the 3 horizons thinking that allows us to spot patterns of hope. Where can we see something is cooking that allows us to think, to believe that a future that is more sustainable is available? So it shows us H1 is business as usual. H3 is the emergent futures. So we don't know what the future will bring, but the best way to understand the future is to see where are the visionaries at the moment, the ones who are really thinking hard about what can the future look like. What are they thinking at the moment? If we want to strive for systems transformation, not just some kind of linear, slow change, then we need to also have a theoretical framework to see, okay, then we need to understand how can that future system look like and make it tangible in the present. So what I'm often doing, and what I did when I was a civil servant, is find all these new pockets of hope, the pockets of the future in the present, where we see, okay, kale is rising. How can we use that? There's an interest in pulses and legumes. How can we use that? So find these pockets of solutions for the future in the present, support it, and work with it. And this is also shows us that at the moment in our current environment, even though we can feel, it's really disheartening that policy isn't changing fast enough, that the slaughterhouses aren't changing their positions fast enough, etc. Well, but in the moment, all of these, both the future and the present and the disruptors are here. So it's our role as policy advisors is sometimes to show that there are alternatives available to status quo, to model out what would it look like from a commercial point of view, from a dietary point of view, etc., if we emphasize these emergent futures. So we need to spot these patterns of hope. Just a moment. Work as a translator of the possible futures and work them into policy. I won't go into much detail with this, just to say that a paradigm shift seems to be underway, and this just gives us a perfect opportunity to start being more bold in what we can strive for when it comes to food systems transformation and the role of policy and scientific advice in that. The pace of change is, as I say, staggering here. 8 years ago, Arla's greenhouse gas plan was almost just greenwashing, 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from plants, not from everything. They weren't even considering reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the methane emissions from the cows, which constitutes by far the largest part of Arla's greenhouse gas emissions. And then only 8 years later, 7.5 years later, they say, we need to be carbon neutral by 2050 from the whole of our industry. And I was speaking with the chairman of Arla, and he said that was completely unheard of 2 years prior. So if you're sitting in a place where you feel, well, we don't really see this level of ambition when it comes to food systems transformation and the appetite, well, we can just say that we didn't see that in Denmark in 2018. And in 2019, some of the biggest pledges was being made. And now Arla is really readjusting, trying to find ways to either they are also doing things at the moment, working on reducing greenhouse gas emissions by introducing completely new series of milk that aren't milk but are white protein drinks, for instance, which was unheard of a couple of years ago. And we see this translated into policy. On the left-hand side, we see the Danish dietary guidelines. When I was a nutritional advisor, I'm not proud of them, but this was what we could present to the public at the time. And when we said, well, shouldn't we have, for instance, some pulses in this picture? I was like, well, people don't know how to use pulses, let's not. And then we see 10 years later on the right-hand side, a completely altered vision for what can a Danish diet for an everyday person look like, with no meat in the picture at all, a huge portion of pulses. And the expectation, the ambition for the Danish government is to tenfold increase the consumption of pulses in Denmark from the current levels, and at least half the consumption of meat. So we're now striving for some levels of change that just was unthinkable when I was an advisor on these issues a couple of years ago. So what are we to do in these windows of opportunity? Well, we need to keep pushing the overarching conversation, talk the new normal into being. For instance, through creating some narratives around less but better meat, something that can bring more stakeholders in, doesn't alienate the stakeholders, but make them prepared for a future that's different than the present. We need to increase the support of the niche, as I showed you. They can provide the pathways for transformation. They can be like, if the niche then shows, well, this could be a viable business opportunity, then the slaughterhouses can grab that niche and say, okay, we will then change our business strategy and transform in this direction, because the niche have showed us that it's feasible and it's profitable. And we need to create consensus among major stakeholders about a future vision of food, so we can have a proper roadmap for transformation. Not just show the paths, but once the paths have been evolved, also map out that and have everyone around the table to create consensus about this is the way we need to go. And then we have these really great policy, soft policy interventions that can facilitate consumer uptake of the new normal. And if you're interested in like specific policies and how the Nordics have been quite good at the changing diets, I can advise you to go to that publication that I've written. It's called The Solutions Menu, and you can find it at my former work. And just the last slide here. We've seen like a new normal arise. It's not as though the Nordics have solved all the problems, as I said, but we've seen that with some clever policy interventions based on some of this thinking, we can really make huge impacts on our diets in the right direction when it comes to nutrition and sustainability. We've seen more than a doubling in the intake of whole grain. We've seen a quadrupling in the organic market. And we see now a slight decrease in the meat consumption in the Nordics. So some of these things that we were thinking, well, the food system is just churning away. It's just going in one way. It's just going from bad to worse. Well, with the right kind of policies, with the right kind of partnerships, by supporting the niche, supporting a new alternative vision, showing new business opportunities, and creating a stakeholder partnership around a future vision that it's different from the present, we can really make some interventions that's working. So I'm not going into detail with all of these, but just saying we can do this. But it needs all of us to have that attitude that we can actually be impactful in this window of opportunity. So thank you. That was me for now.